when I had an automobile accident when I was 15 years old. This was in 1970. So those of you who can do the math know that I'm old. But when I had my automobile accident in 1970, previous to that, I was going to Culver Military Academy and had just finished up my second year at Culver Military Academy, so I was no longer a plebe. I was eligible for rank, and that happened to be the year right before Culver went co-ed. So I really screwed things up. But at any rate, I broke my neck in an automobile accident, and when I spent about 6 months in the hospital, and then about 6 more months up at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, learning how to drive and pop wheelies and things like that. Then the task of going back to finish my schooling came into question. And we talked a little bit, my mom and dad had talked a little bit about Culver and going back there, and Culver was very willing to be able to do that. But I was our parents were living in Spencer, Indiana, which was down south around Bloomington. And Culver Military Academy was up in the northern part of the state, quite a ways away. It was about a 3-hour trek. And Mom and Dad had just experienced the tasks of dealing with somebody with a spinal cord injury and urological tract infections and bowel issues and all those other fun things that go along with a spinal cord injury, and decided that probably having their son 3 hours away in a not really accessible school was not necessarily the best option. So we looked around Spencer, and again, this was in 1971, and Spencer had just built a brand new school. So we figured I would go back to school at Spencer, Indiana. Unfortunately, that brand new 2-level school had no elevator in it because there was no requirement for it to have an elevator. So the only way to get from the lower level to the upper level was by going up 10 steps, a landing, and 10 more steps. The other option was going to school in Bloomington at Stone Belt, which was about a half an hour away. But the problem for me anyway, in my mindset, was Stone Belt was a school for not only people with developmental disabilities, but also mental disabilities. It was not clearly the caliber that Culver Military Academy was, and not, I felt like, and Mom and Dad felt like, a very viable option. So we said, my dad and Mom said, we're going to go to school in Spencer at this brand new school, and we're going to arrange our classes so that the first part of the day I'd be downstairs, the second part of the day they'd carry me up 10 steps, a landing, 10 more steps. Now the superintendent of the school said, oh my gosh, we can't do this. The liability issues are going to be monumental. It so happened that my dad was the school attorney and said he's going to go to school here. If I had not had that kind of support, I would have had to have been forced to go to 30 miles away to a school for people with developmental disabilities, and probably not succeeded to the level that I was able to at Spencer, and then go on to school at Ball State University and be able to finish my education there. Because of that kind of advocacy, because of that kind of resistance to saying, you know, the superintendent must know better than we do, or we can't do this because of fill in the blank, we said, this is the way that it's going to go. And I think advocates need to be more resistant to succumbing to the individuals with the acronyms past their name, or the people in authority and people in positions of authority, to say, this is not what we want to have happen here. We want this for our child. We want this for ourselves. Being from Spencer, Indiana, and near Bloomington, we looked at IU. IU's campus, while it has gotten better over the years, was so spread out, so large, that accessibility-wise, it didn't matter. And there are a lot of older buildings down there that, you know, are a real challenge for anybody. So we opted for Ball State. This was in 1974 when I was graduated from Spencer High School. Went to school at Ball State and found a guy named Rich Harris, who was at that point the director of the director of student services at Ball State, and they had already set up a program where individuals with disabilities would be teamed up with a roommate aide and go to a school there at Ball State, stay in the dorm with a roommate aide in his or her room, and that person would then help them with their individual needs as they were going about the task of living in an apartment complex or dorm complex, as opposed to having a special area for people with disabilities.
Yeah.
So Rich was in charge of that, and as a matter of fact, this was called the Disabled Students in Action, DSIA, and I was able to work with Rich and consulted with him and incoming students with disabilities as they were hooked up with their individual roommate aides. And I met a number of great people. Some of them I still have relationships with today that I met at Ball State, which is, again, one of those necessary things. It's not necessarily the education that you get as much as it is the communication, the contacts that you make at school, at college, to wind up in positions where you're able to do the things that you want to do, enjoy the opportunities that are out there. There have been some significant changes, even though the ADA was passed in 1990 and it was implemented in 1992. We've gotten now in 2010, the 2010 standards that have changed and made accessibility, I think, even better, because they've given contractors, architects a little bit more of ranges, more definition of what requirements are necessary to make sure that you provided the accessibility. And also, there have been some issues with the definition of a person with a disability and how courts have interpreted that definition. That's changed significantly from the time that the ADA was enacted in 1990, and now we've got what is called the ADA AA, the ADA's Amendments Act, that changed the definition of a person with a disability to make it more broad and more inclusive, because frankly, do we care whether or not the person is a person with a defined disability, or do we care about whether there's discrimination going on? You know, the issue is discrimination. It's a civil rights law, and to have the courts get hung up on the definition of a person with a disability is not the important factor here. The important factor is what action has been taken by an entity to discriminate against somebody with a disability. That's what we're trying to get to and what we're trying to remove. We don't want to get hung up on, well, have they checked this box? Has this been satisfied? We don't care. At least I don't care. I care about what actions you took. And what I really wanted to establish is eliminating that discriminatory action. Why would it matter if I'm a person with a disability? I want to spend my money in your store. Why would it matter if I'm a person with a disability if I can do the job? I want to work for you. And if you make this decision, this employment decision, if I make this accommodation decision based on something that I have no control over, you've essentially said you're a second-class citizen. You're not worthy of being a participant here. And so that's what the ADA is trying to get to. And thankfully, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has tried to move towards focusing on that issue of discrimination. I have been a strong advocate of trying to get people with disabilities to also take responsibility in this whole process. You know, it's one thing to rely so heavily on a law to say, you know, well, I'm protected. You can't do this. You can't do that. Try and move away from that. As a person with a disability, I want you to say, I have this to offer. You know, it's not that you're discriminating against me. You're losing out on me. I should be a part of your business because of what I bring to the table. I should be a part of your business because I got money to spend. You know, do you want that? And if you do, then you'll remove the barriers, because that's the problem. It takes educating not only Joe business owner, Joe employer, or Susie employer. It takes educating Susie, the person with a disability, and Joe, the person with a disability, to know not only what their rights are, but what their responsibilities are. And that's been, if you will, a craw in my seat that I have been frustrated with, because people with disabilities are sometimes some of the biggest whiners. And I don't want somebody who's whining about this. I want somebody who's saying, fine, you don't want me in your place of business? I don't have to be here. There are 100 other stores that sell what you sell. There are 100 other employers that would benefit from what I have to give. And if you don't allow me to do this, if you don't allow me to participate, you're the one losing out, not me.